Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our Impact Cafe. We're going to give attendees just a few more minutes to continue to join the call here, and then our CEO, Jim Maddy, will kick off the conversation.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Speaking on behalf of both Franklin Energy and AM Conservation Group, we are thrilled to kick off Impact Cafe. It's our new energy conservation conversation series, and we look forward to discussing topics that impact our energy industry and grow our clean energy opportunity for the communities that we serve. I'm excited for our first topic, which focuses on post-election energy policy landscape. We know the Biden administration is poised to occupy the White House, but we are still probably a little bit in the dark on the implications at both a federal and a state energy policy level. Let's get to our panel to try to get some answers. First, we have Amy Harder, who is an energy reporter with Axios, a new cutting-edge daily news service. Amy has had an exceptional 20-plus year career reporting on all things energy, environment, and climate change. Prior to her time at Axios, Amy covered the same issues for the Wall Street Journal, as well as National Journal of the Policy Advisory Services company based in DC. Amy, thank you so much. We're glad you could join us today.
Thank you.
Next on our panel is Emily Duncan. Unfortunately, as is the day and age we're in, Emily had some technical issues, so she's audio only. We're still working on it, but I think it's going to probably end up being audio only. But she joins us from National Grid, where she is the Director of Federal Government Relations, a DC lawyer, and a policy advocate. Emily has more than a decade of legislative and regulatory experience with natural gas, renewable, and electric power, and the electric power industries. Thank you today for being here, Emily. And our third panelist is Paula Glover, who has more than 25 years of experience in the energy industry. She is currently the president and CEO of the American Association of Blacks in Energy. I think she's actually doing two jobs, but as of January 1st, she'll be the new president of the DC-based Alliance to Save Energy, which I personally have been involved in for more than a decade. So thank you and congratulations on the new job, Paula, and welcome. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Moderate today's conversation, I'm happy to welcome Marissa Yuchin. Marissa just joined Franklin a bit ago, and she has more than 20 years within the industry. She had tenure at PG&E in many executive roles, as well as O-Power and Oracle. And now she's with Franklin as our new Chief Customer Officer, Chief Commercial Officer. And Marissa, I'll turn it over to you and appreciate you leading the conversation for us here today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. I've really been looking forward to this. Thank you, Amy, Paula, and Emily for joining us. I think it's going to be a great conversation. We certainly have a number of questions we're going to run through as a group, but I'll just say to the audience, please do feel free to use the Q&A, the question part, and I'll scan those throughout the conversation and see if we can fit some of those in as well so that we are interactive and engaging you here. So certainly no shortage of discussion and prognosticating about what might happen with the Biden administration in terms of energy and climate policy. So again, as Jim said, let's see what we can get to with this great esteemed panel. So I'll kick off with the first question. I'll have each of you touch on your thoughts on this one, and it really comes down to climate. So if we think about President-elect Biden, he has said that one of the very first actions that he would take would be to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change. That is certainly meaningful action, but it is certainly not a national policy on climate. The question really is, what do we think is possible and, dare I say, achievable in meaningful climate change policy with the Biden administration, and really knowing that we would have a split Congress? Again, what's possible, what's really achievable? Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, and thank you everybody for joining, and for Franklin Energy for inviting me to take part. This has certainly been top of my mind over the last several months and plus year, in fact, given the elongated situation of the presidential campaign these days. I would say that the prospects for big climate policy are much less than they were before the pandemic and the ensuing economic recession. The twin crises of the public health and recession was really grabbing a lot of attention that I think would have gone to climate change had this not occurred and we were all in this terrible situation than we are today. But even if something like carbon tax or cap and trade, anything like big like that is not possible, I still think the Biden administration will be going as fast as they can, as aggressively as they can. And that includes in the administration, really sort of restoring everything that Trump did. I think you, as an energy company, really understand sort of the swinging pendulum of Washington policy. And so, you know, we've seen this for decades, right? The George W. Bush administration didn't do much on environmental issues. And then, well, Clinton did a lot, and then Bush came in and sort of didn't do much. And then Obama came in and did an aggressive move to the left. Trump came in, did an aggressive move to the right, and now I expect an aggressive move back to the left. But because climate change is a cumulative problem, meaning the longer we wait, the harder it gets to solve and the bigger the policies are needed, Biden needs to go even more aggressive in order to, you know, stay on the limits of what scientists say is necessary. But of course, the politics are incredibly fraught. So of course, big regulations at the EPA. But it's not just the typical things at EPA that you might expect. It's also doing things like, you know, doing financial leverage, financial regulations through the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's leveraging what the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can do. I'm sure many of you work with FERC on a regular basis. And so given the lack of big action in Congress, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, I expect Biden to sort of turn over every nook and cranny he can. But at the end of the day, every expert I talk to says in order to reach his goals of 2035 carbon-free electricity and 2050 carbon-free economy, he's going to need new legislation. And I don't see that in the cards anytime soon. And because those goals are going to have to be part of America's new commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, I expect Biden to lean heavily and collaborate heavily with states that have been moving ahead over the last 4 years. And experts I talk to say that there's really nothing stopping a federal government from including subnational reduction progress in a federal goal to the Paris Climate Agreement. So I would expect that when the Biden administration submits its new commitment to the Paris Agreement, which will be sometime middle or late next year. I think you're on mute, Marissa.
I am, thank you. And I think you made a great point there, which is subnational is real. I mean, I think just this week we saw, was it mayors from Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio saying that they wanted to do, you know, a $60 billion push away from fossil fuels. So it can go even to the local level. Paula, love to hear your thoughts on this opening question. What's possible?
Yeah, I think I agree with so much that Amy has already said. I think the thing that we should also kind of keep in mind are a couple things. One, that I think the Biden administration's goal is going to be how close can we get to net zero emissions? And I don't expect that he will begin to choose sources though. So he may have goals around getting to net zero, but that may not be 100% renewables. Because that has another set of complications that he's going to have to contend with, and you don't need 100% renewables necessarily to get to net zero, and so we need to keep that in mind. I think he'll be thinking a lot about science and technology and what role does technology play in this larger narrative about energy efficiency. He probably will be thinking a little bit about nuclear existing plants, and is there some new technology on the horizon that could also get us to this overall goal. And he's still going to have to be thinking about, particularly as it relates to nuclear, what are we doing with spent fuel and all those other issues. I also think, though, and to Amy's first point, he's got this economic issue that he has to deal with. And so all of that is also going to have to be wrapped up in how is he going to get the economy back going. And that means it's also going to include some provisions around, I think, job creation, likely workforce development, likely small business growth, all of those things, I think he'll use climate and should use climate, quite frankly, as a tool to also meet those other goals that he's going to have.
Well said. Emily, love to get your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, really agree with everything that Amy and Paula have pointed out. I think, Paula hit on something that I think is really key, right? Is that the first crisis that he is going to face when he enters office is COVID and the economic fallout. And so I think anything that Democrats or Republicans put forward on the climate front is going to have to be somehow tied to the economy, right? So I think jobs, as Paula pointed out, is going to be key. I think it's also possible to see technology R&D, right? Maybe an infrastructure bill that would kind of tie in some of the clean energy stuff we'd like to see. But I think to Amy's point, it's going to be moderate incremental change. We're not going to see these large climate packages that I think we were all potentially expecting in a blue wave. I could also see potentially some movement on tax credits, right? I mean, that's something that is very important to the clean energy industry. And if Republicans have something they want desperately enough and are willing to trade for clean energy tax credits, we could see some movement there potentially. But I think it's also going to force both Democrats and Republicans to think more creatively, right? I mean, so I think there has been so much focus on the tax code to move clean energy policy forward. But in talking to Senate Finance and Ways and Means staff, they are starting to look at other kind of rebate and spending and appropriations programs that can help move the needle because tax credits have become so controversial. So I think the bottom line is you're not going to see these huge packages. You're going to see, smaller, more incremental change, but hopefully moving the ball forward on climate in some way or other.
Great, thanks. Amy, if we look back to 2009 to the ARA funding, Recovery Funding Act, a lot of money flowed into a lot of things, but on the energy side, certainly we saw a lot of money going into energy efficiency. That was really the kickoff for smart grid, a lot of smart metering money. What are you hearing about potential clean energy related provisions to a stimulus or recovery act from Congress?
Right, I think it was $90 billion that was put into clean energy back then. And sort of to answer this from a big picture perspective first, and then I'll go into some details. A lot of experts I talked to say that $90 billion really helped sort of put down a down payment, and it was a big reason why wind and solar and other technologies are as cheap as they are today. Now, I think another big component of that is state renewable portfolio standards, but nonetheless, the federal money did have a big role. And given the lack of sort of a big market signal policy in the next 2 to 4 years, there's a recognition occurring across the spectrum of the Democratic Party, including progressives, who are basically conceding the fact that they're not going to get something big. So they want to do another big down payment in hopes of continuing to reduce the price of these technologies such that eventually bipartisan support will grow for something that will then be a market signal in 2 to 5 to 6 years. Given the way politics are, it's much easier to support a technology that's affordable versus one that's not. So I think that's sort of the big picture perspective of people. Specifically, I think one sort of benchmark that I think some critics will point to is Biden's $2 trillion spending goal of clean energy over 4 years. As part of his climate plan. That's what he said on the campaign trail. I was recently talking with John Podesta, who many of you may know that name. He's a longtime Democratic operative, worked in the Bill Clinton administration and has more recently focused his time on climate change. I asked him what won't be able to be achieved other than things like a carbon tax, but what else won't be able to be done? And he laughed and said, well, given Republicans are probably going to control the Senate, they're going to have to knock off a few numbers out of that $2 trillion goal, which is to say, I don't see, but I'm humble enough to know that Congress acts in unpredictable ways. I don't see the bipartisan support for something like another $90 billion into clean energy. There's just so much rancor on so many topics outside of climate change and energy. I'm talking the Supreme Court and these other battles that are really just sucking up all the goodwill in the room. But that all said, some specific things, I do expect there to be some deals on clean energy. Specifically, just this week, I watched with interest that a bipartisan group of senators introduced a bill that would give support to existing nuclear power plants to stay open, and also give support to advanced nuclear power. So that has Senator John Barrasso, chairman of the EPW committee, who I actually think is going over to the Energy Committee next Congress, but of course will still play a key role in this debate. I think Senator Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, is on that bill, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. I'm not sure if Whitehouse is, but I know Booker is. And that type of bill, I think, will get support, and it's definitely something that I could see crossing the finish line. And it has a humongous impact. I think the debate over existing nuclear power is one where even progressives who do not like nuclear power are coming around to acknowledging that that's something that they will sort of, take the tough pill for the greater good of climate change. And then things like carbon capture technology, I also think could get support. And then wrapped up with, the more controversial technologies that Republicans like carbon capture and nuclear power. I also see more support for wind and solar. And then lastly, sort of one interesting thing that I'm in the process of reporting now, it's something that is a proposal that progressive groups like, and I mention progressives because of course they're influential in the public discourse, is this proposal by the National Wildlife Federation that would give a tax credit indexed to the intensity of fossil fuel generation. So the cleaner the fossil fuel is, or the dirtier it is, the more it would be pushed out. And so creative things like that might be something that we see come up next year.
Thank you. That was great. I think you definitely, you're super well connected given your role as a journalist, and it was really helpful to hear that. Thank you. Paula, how do we think about planning? Now, how should Congress be thinking about planning to ensure equity and environmental justice is factored into a stimulus or recovery package? I'm not sure that it was really there the last time. We know that these communities, lower income, communities of color, disadvantaged communities have been exceedingly hit hard by COVID, and the economy has left many of them behind. And certainly, environmental justice issues are just one of many. So how should Congress be planning for equity and environmental justice in anything stimulus or recovery related?
Wow, so that's a big question. I think, President-elect Biden sent a couple of signals in his speech last week when he said, that the African-American community always has his backs and he will has theirs. And I think that was a really strong signal that he's going to be looking at equity and certainly the wealth gap as one way to kind of show the African-Americans who had monumental support for him in this election, that he's going to do better. We also know, though, that after the first round of COVID lending, the SBA loans, the PPP, as well as the EIDL, that they then had to go back and be more directed at community development banks and Black banks to ensure that those small business owners were going to get access to the money, because they didn't get access the first time for a whole host of reasons. And so I would expect that any kind of stimulus package is going to have those kinds of things in mind. How can he be more directed at those communities, whether it's funding and spending? But also, I think he's also going to be thinking, to my earlier response, about how does he broaden the economy and the ability for these communities to participate in the overall economy. And then you get back to things like workforce as well, things like access to capital, targeting where lending is coming from, targeting communities that you may be doing work in. Those, I think, are the kinds of things in terms of equity that he's going to be looking at, but also in terms of environmental justice. And I think the last thing that I would hope that he would think about is, for these communities, is also affordability. I think that's part of why some of his response to climate change may be a little bit more measured in terms of how he rolls out his plans, because he's got this other thing he's got to deal with. And we should not forget that in our industry, we also have a lot of people who are sitting in the middle of moratoriums for utility bills, for student loan debt, for rent, and so on and so forth. And so as he's thinking about pushing money into the economy, he's got to take into account all of these other things. And so I would not be surprised if he's also thinking about, in the recovery package, how does he push money to those particular individuals for those types of needs?
Yeah, it's true. It's the bigger pair. I mean, I think there's a good theme I'm hearing here, which is, and Amy, you hit on it right out of the gate. It's the economy, and that will drive a lot of the impact and direction of what can happen on climate and clean energy. Let me see, Emily, you're at a utility, National Grid, very, very big utility. How does a utility like National Grid respond to the change of administration in Washington? Is it likely to have a material impact on how the company goes about and thinks about long-term planning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I think in 2016, we all kind of got out of the prognosticating business. And so we all have to be prepared for any outcome. And so we certainly at National Grid, we're prepared for any outcome at the federal level in the election. But I think there are kind of two key points that I want to land here. I think the first is that National Grid operates primarily in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, all very progressive and frankly aggressive states going after climate goals, right? And so we really take a lot of our, put a lot of our long-term planning into thinking about how can we help our states meet these goals. And so that's really been the driving force for the most part, particularly over the last 4 years when we didn't see federal leadership on the climate front. We really started looking to our states for some direction there. And so I think that's the first point. And then I think the second point I make is that, as a large company, as a utility, we also, of course, have our own internal goals, right? And so our North Star is our net zero by 2050 goal. And that's really driving our long-term planning. So while we obviously look forward to working with any new administration, whichever, whoever comes into the White House on our shared priorities, we really recognize that federal policy is only a piece of our planning puzzle, and that states and our own internal guiding light are what really drive our business moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. I've been following how many states, a couple dozen more actually, I think, that have their own climate goals. And utilities, I mean, some of the largest utilities, all the names you would recognize, National Grid included, have set their own, whether it's a net zero or carbon reduction or renewables. Primarily, they're mostly on climate and carbon. But yeah, it's full steam ahead for many businesses, both in the utility industry and far beyond. I think there's been a restlessness over the last many years of not seeing enough progress and not wanting to wait. So I'm very familiar with the National Grid plan and putting those big audacious goals out there. So I think you guys have shown great leadership there, and and that's really how the needle, I think, will get moved while politics is politics. Amy, back to you. If you were to point to one or two policies that you think could really move the needle on climate and clean energy that could achieve bipartisan support, what would those be? I know you touched on a lot when we talked about what could potentially be in a stimulus package, but where do you think there's a real rallying opportunity? Energy efficiency, I know for one, has been a real bipartisan issue over the years, but I'm really curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah, certainly. I tend to be a negative Nancy when it comes to people who want action on climate change. I constantly tell them that it's big policies unlikely anytime soon. I wrote that in March before the pandemic and before obviously the outcome of the election, that big climate policy was unlikely. That was true before the pandemic, and it's even more true now. But there are some experts out there who are eternal optimists. And when it comes to climate policy, I like to emphasize that as a journalist, I just call it as it is without any bias. But there are some experts who say something like a clean energy standard for the electricity sector could be possible. And there's already a bipartisan bill on this measure in the House, sponsored by Congressman McKinley from West Virginia and Schrader from Oregon. And that's sort of a unique, you wouldn't expect a West Virginia Republican to support something like that. And so I think this could, and maybe not out of the gate again because of the economic and public health crises, but maybe in the second year of the next Congress, there could be support growing for something like that. And I think for me, the players I'll be watching are less the progressives that are very loud on social media and more the unions and the natural gas interests who, although Biden doesn't go out of his way to say he likes natural gas. He certainly goes out of his way to say he's not going to ban fracking. And I think that's really important subtle politics that would play into that. In terms of, but of course that's just the power sector. The power sector is already moving ahead, as we've heard in this conversation already. And so I think the tough nut to crack will be the transportation sector. And there's already been a bill introduced that basically puts on a national scale what California is doing to ban or to phase out sales of new gasoline powered cars. And something like that, I think, does not have support in Congress. Absent something like, so then I'll just briefly address the potential for a carbon tax. There's the lifers out there in the Washington community that will always say there's the potential for a carbon tax. I used to think there was more potential for this a couple of years ago. I think the recession really makes that difficult. I talked to somebody who's this was a few months ago, so it's during the campaign, somebody who was close to the campaign who said a carbon tax is almost always the perfect policy, except when you're coming out of a recession. And we're still in the recession. So, of course, one potential big draw to a carbon tax is the fact that it can raise a lot of money. And, we're bumping up against a lot of financial deadlines, and a lot of funds, government funds, Social Security and things like that will be drying up in the coming years. And that could kind of force action. Republicans, when they've been in control, don't really care about deficit spending. I think we should all be prepared for them to suddenly care about deficit spending with a Democrat in the White House. So I think longer term, if a carbon tax happens, it won't be just to save the planet. It'll be to also save a lot of financial problems. But again, I give that very low odds. I think a clean energy standard for the electricity sector, even though it's only one sector and not as efficient as something like a nationwide carbon tax, is still more politically palpable than a carbon tax.
Thanks. Just a reminder to all of you who have joined us today, please feel free to submit your questions. I have one so far and that I'll turn to in a moment, but would love to see more coming in from you. So what's on your mind? Share it in the question tab. Paula, we know that executive orders have been a real favorite of the current sitting president. I think, in fact, in his first 100 days, I read he issued 24 executive orders. So, and that has certainly continued throughout his 4 years. Should we expect to see a Biden presidency, the president himself, go forward with that type of approach? And anything you think energy or climate related could be in those early executive orders?
Sure. Yeah. So I do think he'll be looking at executive orders, and even more so depending on what happens January 5th in Georgia. So you flip Georgia, you may see a little bit more legislative action than you would have if that does not occur. And so, yeah, I think there'll be more executive orders. I'm not quite sure if there'll be as many as our current President Trump, but that's the way to get things done when things are holed up everywhere else. I think, President-elect Biden has made it pretty clear that climate is going to be a priority. And so he may look at how does he establish climate policy and executive orders across all government agencies. So maybe ordering whether it's Commerce, Treasury, Energy, Interior, to consider climate in some of their decision making. That may be something he would do. As Amy alluded to earlier, there always seems to be this desire to just undo what the person did before them did. And so we know that President Trump spent a lot of time trying to undo all of the Obama administration regulations. And I would expect that President-elect Biden is going to now go back and undo those things that he can, that President Trump did. So thinkings around clean air, emission standards, maybe even the methane ruling, those kinds of things he may take a look at. And then, the big things, the Dreamers Act, so immigration reform, maybe reversing the Muslim ban that President Trump established. He's already said we're going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. He is likely to rejoin the World Health Organization, and then ending oil and gas leases on public lands. I would expect he would do that pretty quickly as well. So it's the thing about Washington, and kind of probably why we pay more attention to state policy, is that back and forth for an industry that needs some consistency, because our planning is so far out. You can't necessarily rely on one administration to give you policy that you can plan off of, because the next group could just reverse all of that, and you can't operate your business that way.
Yeah, exactly. Which was sort of the impetus for my question earlier to Emily around how does a large corporation in this energy space think about when a change of administration comes in. Okay, Emily, over to you, and then I'm going to turn to the questions that I'm starting to see come in. So keep populating those. So we certainly know that over the last several years, state regulatory arena seems to be where a lot of progress is being made, particularly when you think about political stalemate in Washington. And it's certainly where the rubber meets the road in terms of what impacts customer bills and the businesses in the energy industry. So when you look at both state and federal regulation, where and what movement, what might we actually expect in the next 4 years? And do you foresee a Biden administration supporting the states, or just largely not trying to get in the way of them?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, Paula hit on something that I'd like to highlight, which is I completely agree that I think at the federal level, we will see, a Biden administration roll back many of the moves that Trump made to restore some of the Obama regulations, like the methane standards that Paula mentioned. But I think one question I have is, does he not only do that, but then go a step further, right? So what would more aggressive methane standards look like? What would be more aggressive than a clean power plan, for example? Certainly on siting and permitting, NEPA, things like that, I think we will see action there. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that, not only does he have a moderating I don't want to say problem, but a moderating force in Congress, if you will, because of a Republican Senate, but he may have that at the regulatory level as well, right? I mean, what you have to remember is that Senate Majority Leader McConnell has spent the last 4 years, putting conservative judges on courts across the country. And so any regulation that a Biden administration puts forth is going to have to really be careful to stay within the jurisdiction of that particular agency, because they will face challenges in court and may have a harder time because of the conservative makeup of the judiciary in many instances. I think the other thing to look at is who he puts into his cabinet, right? I mean, that is also going to be moderated by a Republican Senate, and more moderate cabinet positions means likely more moderate regulations that come out of those various agencies. And so those are kind of two things I think to keep in mind. But I do think certainly at places like FERC, where I think even if there is, a Democratic chairman, there will be still a Republican majority at FERC. I think there are opportunities for some bipartisan regulatory movement. I think some examples are transmission policy, right? I think this is an area where states would love a little bit more direction. We're going to need significant transmission investment if we are going to bring all of these renewables online to meet these state goals that we've talked about. And those are not going to be transmission lines within one state, right? They're going to be regional, they're going to be interregional. And so FERC has a real role to play there. And I think we will see potentially movement there. Commissioner Glick has already come out this morning talking about, if he were chairman, what he would focus on, capacity markets, certainly lowering barriers for clean energy. And some of the commissioners on FERC, including Chatterjee, have indicated their willingness to work with a potential Chairman Glick on things like natural gas projects. So I think there are opportunities. Again, though, folks are going to have to get creative and get along, right? I think at the state level, again, I think states would welcome, certainly from a FERC perspective, a bit more direction on the regional markets and how those operate. But all of this uncertainty continues to lead me to believe that a lot of action is going to happen in state legislatures, and they're not going to wait for a Biden administration. These legislatures meet for very limited sessions, in some cases only every other year, so they have to hit the ground running. And so I think we'll see a lot of movement there. And then I think from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, certainly from a utility perspective, we expect our regulators to continue to review and approve rate cases that include pilot projects for a range of technologies, right? So hydrogen is something we're certainly keeping a very close eye on. CCS, which Amy mentioned, transportation electrification, time of use charges, all of those things that are going to help, drive for the climate change agenda, I think states are going to, and state regulators are going to be keeping a close eye on.
Great, thanks. All right, we have a lot of questions that have rolled in, so thank you to everybody who has who have put those in. Let's see, I'm just going to start running through them. Some of them are targeted at some of you, and others are just for everybody. So this will be an everybody. Can you talk about the Green New Deal, and is it a feasible option for updating our infrastructure while providing stimulus to the economy?
I can take that. I don't think anything like the Green New Deal as it's articulated by and spelled out in the resolution sponsored by AOC and Senator Markey, I don't think that will have any traction. And I don't think the Green New Deal, Biden didn't really embrace it much on the campaign trail. And so I think you could see sort of things like the Green New Deal make it into some sort of infrastructure package. Certainly there'll be an attempt by Democrats to do that. But the Green New Deal, as it's really known in terms of like the 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030 and federal job guarantees and federal health care, all those things are really just not going to happen. But in terms of a slogan, you might hear it articulated by some progressives on the campaign trail. I don't expect Biden to really use that language.
Others?
I would agree with everything Amy said, so I have nothing to add.
Same here. Yep, she said it perfectly.
Got it. All right, let's go to another question from the audience here. Actually, Amy, this one's directed at you. Any insight into prospective Biden administration policies regarding the U.S. military and its impacts on climate?
It's interesting. The military has been one area under the Trump administration that hasn't had a lot of public fights over climate change. The military under the Obama administration played a key role in two ways. One, in sort of elevating it as a threat. I think the term threat multiplier really came into fruition during the Obama years and the Pentagon under Obama. And the other way is through federal procurement and advancing technologies. And the military has such a vast footprint. I really expect a lot of that, which was present in the Obama years, to come back even more aggressively under a Biden Pentagon. Just one key evidence of that, Sharon Burke, who worked on these issues in the Obama years, is on the transition team for the Pentagon. So, and you see that across sort of the 500 people that Biden tapped to run these transition teams. Climate and clean energy people are really peppered throughout that entire list, including at the Pentagon. So I expect this to be one of the most aggressive areas outside of, EPA and the Interior Department, where you'll see a big push by the Biden administration to really leverage every inch of the military for those two reasons I mentioned. But then the third one is the respect that the military garners around the world and with Republicans and conservatives.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for that, Amy. Here's an interesting question. Maybe Paula, you want to take this one first. And it really points to the fact that, if we will struggle to get bipartisan support in Congress to move, material things forward potentially, the voice of citizens, sort of the rally of citizens in support or in favor of certain energy policies, has in the past proven to be effective. Could that work? Could a coordinated consumer education push create enough pressure with legislators to actually compel support for clean or climate-based policies?
I mean, I think in theory it absolutely could, but I would also say that if you look at who is really pushing for cleaner climate-based policies, it's actually not representative of the entire consumer base. And so that's really the rub. If you look at whether it's large environmental organizations, large energy organizations, you don't see a lot of people of color who live and work in the communities that are most impacted having the voice and providing that message. And so I think the ability to really build that kind of coalition, that broad of a coalition, could be really impactful, but it would have to be broad. And there would have to be some sensitivity to, I think, in that coalition building that there are areas of the country where the way that you address climate change is going to look different for someone maybe in Kentucky than it will in California. And so is there a willingness to compromise and be flexible in that coalition building and understanding that not all your responses, everyone's not going to say the same thing. There are going to be some people who are going to say, I want zero carbon and I think nuclear is the way to go. And so the broad, how do you bring all of those disparate views into a coalition to have the kind of impact that we're describing is going to be, I think, worthwhile, but really difficult to do.
Yeah, if I could add on to that,
Please.
Marissa. So I completely agree with Paula, and I think where those consumer-led initiatives have been most impactful is at the local level, right? On a specific project in somebody's neighborhood, kind of the NIMBYism that we're all familiar with, because that's when you really have people from those communities, coming together to push on an issue like that. And I think one of the things we've seen is when you do attack this from more of a kind of a national or statewide perspective, there are communities that get left behind. And so, one of the things we've really been stressing at National Grid is, yes, we want to move towards this clean energy future. We are on that path, but we have to think of everyone. We have to make it affordable. We have to make it reliable. And so how do we continue to kind of keep those three legs of the stool, if you will, moving forward as we make this transition, because we think that's really vital.
Yeah. That leads me to another question, which is related to President-elect Biden's, goal of improving efficiency in buildings by 50% by 2035, which is quite ambitious, and certainly creating incentives, for deep retrofits. That would be a very big undertaking. Energy efficiency programs have been running for decades, and we know that it's slow, steady progress when you think about the total volume of buildings that need to be touched. So what's it going to take to achieve that kind of ambitious goal of retrofitting 50% of the buildings in the US by 2035? And importantly, how do we make sure that it isn't just buildings and homes of people who have means, but a real equitable approach to how we actually make progress on that goal?
That's a big one. So if I'll use the state where I live, New Jersey, as an example, where my utility got a huge put in a rate application to do exactly what you've described in terms of energy efficiency retrofits in large buildings, public buildings, government buildings, schools, et cetera, et cetera. I think that application was in the $2 billion range, maybe a little bit more. But part of what they also committed to doing was kind of the workforce development, small business spending, really trying to deal with the kind of racial equity issues that exist in the state of New Jersey as a part of that. And so if you think about that number in the state of New Jersey, which was not going to cover every single building, right, every government building and every home, and then think about how do you multiply that across 50 states? It's just really, really expensive. I would also say, though, that to the other part of your question, which is how do you make sure that these kinds of programs support the people who really need them and not the people who can afford to do it yourself, that's the question around equity, right? That how do you direct the programs in such a way? And it means that I think certainly in a regulatory construct, we have to think about it differently, which is we may be investing in homes and not using a standard, which is how do I get the most for my dollar, right? I'm going to spend $500 in every home, when you know that in certain disadvantaged communities, $500 doesn't even get you in the door because there's some structural things that have to happen way before you can invest in energy efficiency. And so that makes it more complicated and certainly more expensive, but it's also not the way that we develop our programs. And so what I'm describing then would require regulators and others to actually think about what are the goals that you're trying to have a company achieve. And so if, for example, you say in the state of New Jersey, I want you to make sure that every low-income household has all the energy efficiency that they need to lower their bill. That investment could be pretty significant for that household. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, that our commissions would be ready to make those kinds of investments. and then leave everyone to the side. It doesn't work that way. And finally, I would say we have this overarching narrative, and certainly in our industry, of really not speaking to customers where they are so that they even understand what the heck we're trying to do. And that is another cost that's applied to it. We assume that we're doing this great thing, and therefore if we put in a bill insert or we send out a flyer, the customers read it, they love it, and it's all good. And we started this conversation talking about the fact that we are in a recession. So if I can imagine if I'm working from home or not working from home with a child who I'm trying to send to school but can't go to school because of a pandemic, and my unemployment ran out and there is no more $600 and all this other stuff, there's nothing that you're sending me in the mail from the light company that I'm actually paying attention to, because I've got about 12 other things that are increasingly way more important. And we need to figure out, I think, as an industry and as policymakers, how do we create a narrative in that particular environment to get to kind of the outcomes that we think would really be helpful.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, certainly in energy efficiency, there's really two parts to it, right? There's not only the stuff that you can install, but it's how you use it, and that education and behavioral component, and convincing people just educating them on what's good for them. That's great. You know, an interesting question came in. It's a little less associated with sort of policy, but I do think that it is related, and it's around investor pressure. And I don't know, Amy or any of you really want to touch on this one. But sort of the role that plays, and I think about, was it Blackstone Group in the last year made some significant announcement around their investments and their expectations for companies in their portfolio. But how does that, you know, how does sort of investor pressure play in either to policy or just the decisions that businesses are going to be making?
I can make a sort of a big picture comment on this and then go into a little bit more detail. The investor pressure component is one of the puzzle pieces that I often talk about in terms of how things have evolved over the last decade. Investors have really come out of the woodwork in the last couple of years to put pressure on all sorts of companies. I watch most closely the oil and gas companies to green their portfolios, and I think it's one of the key pieces that will eventually support big climate policy, because if they're not seeing, you know, and these investors are not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, they're doing it out of two reasons. One, the economic opportunities that come with cheaper wind and solar and other technologies, and also the economic impacts of a warming world. So it's sort of twofold there. And so I think in terms of the impact on sort of the overall debate and Washington policymaking, I anticipate that to be sort of one of many influence levers. I do think there's going to be, so one interesting dynamic is that it's easy for, you know, potentially affected parties to be for something when it's not on the table. So for example, all these oil and gas companies have come out to support a carbon tax more recently, and banks are talking about taking these efforts, you know, to not support drilling in the Arctic, for example. So they're pursuing climate change on their own terms. But conflict will be inevitable once Biden does what he wants, or what congressional Democrats do on their terms. And so I anticipate, you know, although investors and banks and others want action on climate change, it might not be the same action that a Biden administration wants. So, for example, any sort of pressure that the SEC or others could put on banks, you know, they may not want that. They may want to do it on their terms. So even though everybody is now generally on the same page that yes, climate change is real, it's a problem, we should do something about it, there's going to be a huge debate about what to do. But nonetheless, just to conclude, like, the fact that the banks are on board with doing something, I think is really significant, along with several other sort of pieces of this puzzle.
Great. You know, so this conversation today around both climate and affordability especially makes me think about the question of natural gas, you know, and I think within the Democratic Party, there's a real range of support or lack thereof of the role of natural gas in the future of addressing, you know, clean energy and even climate change. And I just wonder, in terms of thinking about it from an affordability standpoint, we have a tremendous amount of infrastructure that exists and needs to continue to be maintained in this country. and it is an efficient fuel when used directly. There are a lot of states that are moving towards a heavy push on electrification, even when those approaches may or may not lead to an affordable option for the end customer. So to any of you who may want to touch on that, like, how do we balance this affordability element and needing to make progress on climate and carbon reduction, particularly when we think about natural gas?
Yeah, this is Emily. I can go first if you want. I mean, I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right? It's the one that we're certainly struggling with it at National Grid. I think, one of the points we try to make is we have invested billions of dollars in this distribution system, and it would be such a waste to just walk away from it, right? And so is there a way for us to green our gas system and maintain affordability while also using this existing system that our customers have paid for and are continuing to pay for, right? And so that's why we think hydrogen is going to be vital moving forward, renewable natural gas, biomass. We're looking at all of these solutions to try to simultaneously keep us on the path forward on clean energy and reaching our climate goals, but also trying to maintain customer bills, it's certainly during a pandemic and a recession at an affordable level. So yeah, that's something we struggle with on a daily basis and are continuing to focus on.
Yeah, I do think the conversation around hydrogen, clean hydrogen, I feel like has really amped up in the last few years. Clean sources of natural gas for sure, and biomethane has often been talked about, but hydrogen seems to have really kind of caught on in the vernacular. There's some thoughts on it. Yeah, go ahead.
About the natural gas question. I focus on natural gas a lot because it really is at the center of so many debates, whether you want to push renewables full force or whether or not you're a coal executive. It really is just at the center of everything, whether you like it or not. So the way I see natural gas really filling, like I see the Biden administration sort of very tacitly acknowledging that we can't get rid of gas overnight. I chatted, again, I mentioned John Podesta earlier. He said that, so he's all for getting rid of natural gas domestically. So of course it's a huge undertaking and certainly won't happen overnight, but nonetheless, Podesta represents sort of the more left-leaning side of the party. So what he said about what I'm about to tell you is really illustrative, and that's about the global side of the equation. So exporting natural gas is something that I think this administration, the Biden administration, will sort of tacitly support, given there's still lots of parts of the world that want to displace coal, and natural gas is the good option for that. But domestically, I see just the other day, San Francisco announced it's going to ban new gas hookups in new buildings. And so I anticipate that to continue, given what we've all talked about, the lack of action at the federal level. But I do think, you can tie this into the equity discussion. A few months ago, I did a column, a weekly column at Axios called Harder Line. And I chatted for one of my columns with Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, and also Mark Morial of the National Urban League. And all of them wanted to talk to me publicly to share their concerns about getting off of natural gas too quickly. And so there's concern about affordability. And so I see voices like that being really influential in the debate with the Biden administration, even if they're not the ones tweeting about it the most. Reporters like me spend a lot of our time listening to the bubble and the echo chamber that is social media, but I'm constantly pulling myself out of that because they're not necessarily the ones driving policy.
I would just like to add that I think, and Amy's touched on something, this idea about affordability is really kind of almost central to the conversation around natural gas. And really being able to even identify what affordable means is something that probably we need to do. It's really easy, and I think I read a piece in Greenbiz a couple of weeks ago of someone who was electrifying their home. And his case in this particular article was that there's no need to even think about energy efficiency if you can just go ahead and electrify. But this was also an individual who started out with making a $50,000 investment, right? And so one is like, when you give that particular perspective the microphone and make it seem as if that is normal in and of itself, really does, right, is the reason why we have such disagreement. because the truth is that I would suggest there are probably a whole lot of people who could not just write a $50,000 check and electrify their home. Like that in and of itself, your ability to do that is a big deal. And so the argument around natural gas and affordability is a really important one. And then there's just right, understanding what people's personal preferences are. So I had a conversation with a colleague this week, and I was sharing with him that as much as I know about the new heat pumps, et cetera, you'd have a hard time convincing me to buy one. Because I like having a gas boiler and I want a gas stove, and like that's just my preference, having lived in New England when I didn't have it. And so there's this other kind of blip that we have to do. I would just say, just really broadly, as we talk about policy and in this framework of what is equitable, we need to be talking about it, I think, through the eyes of folks who are not sitting in the seats that we're sitting in today. That we literally, I think I do, and I would suggest most of us on this call have the benefit of making choices and economic choices for ourselves. And the individuals who can't are the ones who really we should be thinking of as we start advocating for whatever policy, those who really can't make that choice because of the economics. And really back to my first statement, and I think that is why dealing with the wealth gap and all these other things are things that the administration is going to prioritize, because that's really how he's going to be able to do the other stuff he wants to do.
Yeah, it's well said. And I'm sure, Emily and National Grid and all the utilities, I mean, they live this day in and day out, right? Trying to move forward, transitioning towards a cleaner energy system, and having to balance that they have a mandate to serve all customers with all abilities to pay. So we're just about out of time. I see Jim's chiming in, so we don't want to keep people over. Can we do a fire, like quick rapid fire, which is maybe 15 seconds each? Are you an optimist or not as it relates to climate policy, knowing that we have a change in administration ahead?
I would describe myself as a realist. So I often report things that people don't want to hear, but that is the reality. So that's how I would describe myself.
I would have said I'm a pragmatist. Optimist. I'm always optimistic, but we have to be pragmatic.
And I would say, those are both good words. I would say, if I had to pick between optimist and pessimist, I would pick optimist. I mean, I think I kind of have to be in Washington, right? It just takes a long time to get stuff done, and things move slowly until all of a sudden they take off and it's unexpected. And I think, I do think that President-elect Biden, he's been in the Senate, he's a creature of the Senate, and if anyone can shape bipartisan policy, I think it's him. So I'm optimistic that he and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, if the Republicans keep the Senate, will be able to do that.
Thank you. All right, this has been wonderful. Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Very well done, Marissa and panelists. Thank you very much. What a fantastic and engaging conversation. Really appreciate all the questions that came in. I know we didn't get to them all, but thank you all for the engagement. And thanks for our first Impact Cafe, our virtual event series. If you have ideas on other topics you want to send us, hit us up on LinkedIn at Franklin Energy. And we're looking forward to hosting this series over time and continuing these conversations. So thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.
GSA.